small number in here, maybe I could change the format a little bit and just make it more of a conversation. So if you want to jump in at any time.
I'll sit on the other side
And I know the three of you saw a variation of this last Tuesday.
Yeah.
And I made some changes to it based on how I felt it went. So maybe you can just talk about if it worked better, if it worked less good, or if you see where it's going, if it's not going anywhere. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about what sort of inspired this, as the title implies. I'm trying to explore if ecological knowledge or our understanding of ecological information can inform how we structure and organize education. I have a number of reasons for thinking why this might work and why it might be a good idea and what kind of results it would have. But I can tell you that my basic impulse for doing this, comes a lot from reading Thomas Berry's work, who's maybe his primary sort of message is that whatever we do in education or in law or in religion has to in some way be primarily referential to the earth as a system, or on a bigger scale to the universe. The universe is kind of maybe a little bit large to deal with on that scale, and I think right now what's really important is our responsibility in relationship to the earth as a planet, as a system. So his idea that the earth needs to be our primary reference, I'm taking a step further and saying that we shouldn't just be making education that's in reference to the earth, but actually organizing disciplines and education and the structure of education in a way that sort of reflects ecological relationships and sort of realities that exist on the earth already, so that they're in line with those relationships, not just in their study, but in their actual structure. So, again, the primary source of revelation here is the planet, and how can we make education that's in line with the planetary system and sort of embed specifically our educational institution in a way that is conciliant with, or that operates within which the parameters that the earth itself has set as functioning systems. So I started again with this quote by Moran. It's another big influence on my thinking, in that our education system is compartmentalized and that the disciplines are all separate. Obviously we're doing a interdisciplinary group here, trying to do this thing with a relationship between disciplines. And I really like his quote here, where he says that our identity as human beings has been, sort of betrayed and sort of siphoned off into little categories, none of which on their own can really explain who we are as individuals or as communities or as cultures and how we relate to things. There's good answers coming from lots of different fields, but ultimately they all reduce our, humanness or our relationship to the planet in one way or another. But my big problem with this, with the compartmentalization, is that when you're doing any subject of study, whatever you're studying, being it natural systems, religions, anthropologies, philosophies, or whatever, is that everything will always have more than one meaning, and that those meanings that you come to through these different disciplines might contradict each other, and that they might not form sort of a cohesive whole that's really headed in one direction, but they say things that sort of imply that the others might not be possible. So I'm trying to look for a way in which these differences can live and actually learn from each other and thrive, rather than being contradictory and sort of eliminating of the other potentials. And so the big problem that I'm seeing again is that we're acquiring these huge levels of information, more information about, science, art, philosophy, religion, particularly because all of these different cultures across the globe are now learning from each other, and the West is beginning to understand what's been going on in the East, and history is taking on a different sort of flavor, where we can understand that science has one story, and the way science shows up in different cultures is different, and just trying to understand that if you're trained in a specific way of seeing in the world, then you often relate to people who also see things in that way. And so we're getting pretty good at sort of making decisions with reference to our own community, within our own, within PCC, we can sort of make decisions that are agreeable to sort of the PCC dynamic in view. Or if you're, coming from like more of like a biological perspective, you can understand things, biologically, and you're kind of at ease with other people who also think biologically. And so, in terms of that, we need to somehow step out of that and see that we need to make decisions not just outside of our own context, our own cultural context, or our own disciplinary training, but also outside of our own species, and recognize that we make decisions that influence and include, other aspects of the Earth system, other species, other environments, and things like that. And so, how can we use education as a way of building that larger context? This is a quote from Ilya Prigogine. He said that no single theoretical language can sort of really articulate physically what's actually happening. So we have all these various possible languages to describe what's happening. And some of them may be complementary, and some of them also may be contradictory. But in essence, they all in some way deal with the same reality that we're interpreting in different ways. But it's impossible to reduce any of these ways to one single description. None of them will actually account for what's happening. There's always something left out when you say something. It highlights certain things and hides other things, and you're bringing certain things into focus and getting really good at training yourself to identify those things and to understand how they operate and how they inform your life. But inevitably, you're going to miss something. So it's a switch from understanding just, one unit as one discipline, or one unit as sort of an isolated object. If you pick an object like the desk or the computer or something, you can talk about it in terms of, maybe what the desk does. And you can say the desk provides a function, and you can say, this is what a desk is. It does these things. Or you can take, a more materialist point of view and say, well, the desk is actually just, this plastic, this metal, and this cloth put together, so it's just like an aggregate of all this physical stuff. Or you could also say, well, but what about how the desk acts in a classroom? It lets you do certain things. If you put a bunch of them together, you can have a classroom, and so there's like another dimension to it here. And this is just like something really simple. But in essence, everything is like this. And maybe the most complicated thing to understand is the human being, and how do you address what a human being is, and how do you address what a human being does in the same complicated way that you could talk about the desk. The other thing that Prigogine is keen to notice is that for humans, reality is always embedded in the flow of time. So even if this desk is holding my jacket and my wine right now, over time it's going to be doing different things. And maybe at some point it's going to get ripped apart and its materials are going to be used for something completely different. So it's always related to its point in time right now. So you have this like diversity of usages that it could have right now, and you could think multiply, almost infinitely, about how many different ways you could use it. But then even more difficult to understand than that is that of all those multiple uses, over time, it's also going to have even more multiple uses. And we need to sort of get into that line of thinking. In a biological sense, what I'm trying to do again is sort of take elements that we understand from life sciences or ecological sciences and apply them to education. I take this idea from Lewontin, who's a biologist working a lot with genetics, and he has this great insight that not just him, but I'm drawing it from him right now, is that in fact, not only do these objects exist in relationships to things, but those objects are changing. What they're in relationship to is changing, and the context in which they're relating to each other is also changing. And they're not just changing randomly. All of these things have an effect to where we designed the desk to do certain things, but then the desk also, in a way, starts to design how we can take notes and how we can be students. We start to understand our relationship to education in terms of the desk. So it starts to shape us in a way. So then we, from that perspective of being shaped, go on to shape something else that would be useful for those means. So in his terms, it's these organisms where we usually think of the environment as, in sort of like the simple Darwinian terms, the environment is selecting organisms and populations, and the ones that work, and the ones that don't get selected out. But in fact, it's more complicated than that, because the organisms themselves are changing the environment in ways that are suitable to their survival. Or they're creating conditions that allow them to reproduce again. So the dialectic there is more complicated than just the environment changing them, because they're also changing the environment. So I think what we need to do in terms of education is to rethink how we think about education in terms of being open to these diverse, evolving influences, and also that we need to specifically align ourselves in certain relationships that allow us to act in the planet. So these are my three.
Could you repeat that last part you just said again? You wouldn't mind?
Yeah. That we need to, in being aware that we have these relationships, and that certain relationships, the synergy of the relationships produces certain effects. The fact that we're aware of that dynamic allows us to put ourselves in relationship to more things that will result in the kind of change that we want to see. We can change our socio-cultural environment through our ideas and through our participation with the ideas that have already come, in the same way that organisms are sort of, in a way, reconstructing their environment. So there's a relationship between organisms and environments, and people and culture, or you and your ideas, or you and your history, or you're shaped sort of by what's happened to you in a way. You have a biography that has effects, that's influenced you, but you're also aware of that, so you can influence it. But it's always in terms of what's happened already. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thanks.
The jump that I'm making is that you're taking these three levels here. The first one is on a genetic level. It's on sort of like the smallest level that we can sort of conceive biology on. We could take it down to atoms and subatomic particles. But if we stick just to life for now, the three sort of principles that hold true is this idea that there needs to be diversity, and there needs to be an interaction of diverse components. And on the genetic level, it shows up in the fact that if there's less genetic variability in a population, it can adapt to a smaller number of conditions. So an increase in genetic variability for that species, or that population rather, results in a greater chance for it to survive in more environments. Or if there's chaotic conditions being introduced into that system that weren't accounted for in the evolution of that species, they'll have a greater chance of being able to respond creatively to it, because there's a greater array in which the genetics can confer. The second level is if you're taking it on so that's like on a population level. If you're taking it as an ecosystem, as like a series of populations interacting with each other, and then if you look at the ecosystem as sort of the unit in this thinking, if you have a greater number of diverse populations, then the ecosystem itself will have a greater chance of surviving. Because if something wipes out one aspect of the system, one species or an invasive species comes in and decimates everything, because everything is sort of uniform and has the same strategy at life, it benefits the system to have a lot of diversity in there. Because the system, even if it gets rocked in one way or another, will have other features that can step in and allow the system to evolve. And the reverse of that is then what you see in sort of like monocrop farming, where if you take an ecosystem and just simplify it down to like the commodities that humans want, then those systems are much more easily wiped out, like what happened with the bananas in the early 20th century. I remember Matamba was talking about this, how we had the bananas we eat now aren't the bananas that were originally sold across sort of the colonial world, because the bananas we used to eat were much sweeter and much softer and much tastier. But we loved those so much that we monocropped them and farmed them everywhere. And then a strain of disease came along that they didn't have any resistance to, and wiped out virtually the entire species of that banana. So now we eat the bananas that we eat today, which have a little bit less taste to them. Whereas if we had a situation where we had cultivated them in a more sort of biodynamic, or in a more like kind of permaculturally oriented way, they would have had a greater level of resistance to respond to it. So the jump I'm making, if we can take this on genetic levels, population levels, and ecosystem levels is that maybe we can apply this to human thinking systems and to education and to other institutions so that they would encourage relationality and diversity of opinion and these types of things, so that, like right now, we're confronted with like huge economic problems, environmental problems, religious conflicts, and all these sort of ideological battles. And because we have sort of, generally speaking, one main framework, one sort of like economic, capitalistic idea of how to do things, and that one framework doesn't have answers to really any of these questions, what we need to do is sort of cultivate a serious kind of diversity in thinking, so that when these situations arise, there will be some sort of feature of the thinking community that will be able to sort of rise up and address these things.
Well, and to use that example, for instance, the countries that are bailing out our country, or rather loaning us money, are all communist countries.
Right, exactly. So the things that are affecting us now...
That's an important thing to
No,
know.
that is an important thing to note. That is an important thing to note, because you know what? They approach economics differently than we do. And we're entwined in this global economic system right now, whether it's a good thing or it's a bad thing, it is. And so those countries who have a different approach are affected by the global economic crisis differently. And so if there was more of that was actually sort of wed into some sort of relationship, when these types of things happen, there'd be more of a response that could actually handle these kinds of planetary issues, which is why I think it's important to think of this in a planetary context, trying to understand how to make how to build institutions or social structures in terms of planetary issues. So these would be, your standard sort of disciplines that you can go into, and they all try to reduce, human beings, and by reducing human beings, you're reducing culture and sort of all things related to humans, everything that goes on within the human sphere of activity gets reduced. You can explain it physically. There's people who's trying to do this. You read E.O. Wilson, he'll try and tell you that within the next 100 years, sociological theory will be reduced to particle physics. In Consilience, he says this. He says, my hope is that at some point we won't have to philosophize or theorize about any of this, but we'll actually have physical laws, like the 3 laws of physics, that can explain how human society works. So he wants to take it all the way down.
Oh, that's painful.
But it's kind of beautiful in a way, but it's just as short-sighted as the other ones. But what I want to say is that, like, we find that that's appalling, and in his mind, what we're doing is kind of appalling.
Oh, yeah.
But so I want to get at is that, like, okay, so you can reduce it to subatomic particles. And what I want to say is that that's just as bad. Because then you miss what's going on with the subatomic particles. You're not even interested. Your filter goes up. You're like, well, this is bad. E.O. Wilson is a nightmare. You have a physiological response because you've organized your brain in this way. So, what some people have, in thinking about this problem, they've come up with this other idea. Well, okay, right. So maybe reducing it to subatomic particles isn't such a great idea. But we also know a lot about chemistry, biology, and human psychology. So if we just add together what we know about all of these things, then we'll get it, right? This is great. We're really integrating this information, and we're really doing this interdisciplinary thing. This is sort of a standard interdisciplinary approach, But just like reducing it to subatomic particles or spiritual activity is inadequate, I think this is also trouble. Because you're just doing arithmetic now with all these reductions, and it still doesn't really account for what's happening. So this is, in a sense, in the same way that organisms and environments are shaping each other, all of these different disciplines, and we could add an infinite number of disciplines and subdisciplines to this chart, but they're all creating one another. Our ideas, especially if you read, like Darwin, if you read, like, the context in which Darwin is coming out of, like his theory of evolution, like, it's not a big jump to go from how he views natural selection to sort of the overriding dominant socio-political paradigm of his time. This is the idea that there are no facts that don't already have theories, and no theories that don't have facts that are already theory-laden. Everything's really enmeshed in this way. So I just want to look at the relationships instead and understand as sort of not a replacement or not like a instead of, but we should also be doing this kind of thing to really understand how our understanding of all of these things is only possible because they have relationships to each other. Because the relationships are what's primary. The relationships really sort of govern the objects instead of objects governing the relationships.
So do you think the task is to get all of those things integrated so that a single individual can be at least conversant or hold the perspectives of each of these fields? Or is it that the fields need to learn to communicate with one another better? Or is it both?
Both. Well, it's like what's his name? The guy who was speaking, Scott. Last Tuesday said, I'm a mile wide and an inch deep.
Right.
There's problems with that. Like he has a good broad overview of a lot of different things, and he's able to take this sort of meta perspective of what's going on, and you see all these interesting relationships, and you see all these shared qualities or shared biases in fields that should be separate.
Right.
But then you don't have anybody that would be like expert in something, and you need experts. You really do.
Well,
Go ahead.
To go from the ecological metaphor as well, like, there are certain species that live in a certain ecosystem, but there are also species that live within the ecotone.
Right.
Academically speaking, I think you need the same thing. You need people like that who are a mile wide and an inch deep to communicate with all of the other people that are an inch wide and a mile deep.
Exactly.
You need somebody with an overarching meta perspective that can be a translator of sorts, be a communicator to begin the conversation. And I think in terms of what Matt was asking, I think the second part predicates the first part.
Right. Well, it almost seems as
soon as everybody starts talking, everyone's going to begin to get basic knowledge in all of these other fields.
It almost seems like with the sciences now, there's too much diversity and not enough interaction. There's no...
So diversity isn't the only element that needs to be there.
Right. It's like there needs to be a meta language that allows all of these fields to communicate.
Well, in theory, we have a meta language.
We do.
In theory, that's science, or the method.
Well, there's like systems theory, and it's trying to bridge the sciences, but we talk about science as if all these different fields have some clear picture of like what the world is to give to us, but each field has its own view of the whole.
So the idea would be to not shut any of those modes down, because to me they're all creative relationships. Even if you're doing like hard science and mathematics, that's a really creative endeavor, and that like speaks to that individual. It opens them up, and they want to pursue that. So this would be more sort of like of a practice to engage in, to avoid only seeing the world through your lens, or to being so impermeable to other people's perspectives that you're not even interested in what they have to say. Or maybe you are interested in what they have to say, but in your mind, whenever they say something, you're like, oh, well, you're only saying this because such and such happened to you because of your father, and like you have this family history, and or oh, you're a rich white guy. What do you really know like about the world? And like, so you put up these filters, So the idea would be to put this into the educational system, not necessarily to acquire a lot of knowledge about everything, but to keep those holes open and to develop a different kind of human and hopefully a different kind of expert that understands that what they're doing is sort of in a genre of reality rather than has like a monopoly on reality, or breaking down sort of like a monopoly on epistemology for what's going on.
And I wonder if what's really driving these specialists and what their passion really amounts to is the desire to explain everything in terms of their specific interest.
Exactly.
What if that is the sole desire for specialization? How do we keep specialization without it? How can we provide a new motivation for specialization that is not
I think it might
totalizing?
be like a mutation of individual. Fascinating.
Right.
This is happening in the health field because the specializations that certain doctors go into, patients will have to go to certain specialists in order to find out exactly how to treat whatever disease they have. And there's a new profession coming out of it called a patient advocate. So this person is kind of their secretary and keeps charge of everything that they're doing because the different disciplines don't communicate at all.
Right.
And so, I don't know.
That's interesting.
It's like something is being created out of the miscommunication.
Right.
The hospitals are realizing that the patient was getting completely lost in all these different diagnoses.
Yeah, papers everywhere, no one's communicating.
Yeah.
This doctor didn't know this about that, and this one.
But you raise an interesting question, because I have to believe that most people, according to their logic, are doing what they think is best. They have a certain framework about how they think the world is and about who they think they are in that world, and also what they can know about the world and what they can do in the world. And based on that, they make decisions. That once you sort of understand what those dynamics are, you could say that they're acting logically within their framework. And I'm not so sure that you can change that, and I'm not so sure you have to. But I think that just the fact that, for me, my passion is kind of understanding why people are passionate about things, and why people are drawn to certain things and not other things, and what dynamics are unconsciously at work, or what dynamics are culturally at work, or environmentally at work, or genetically at work, or whatever, and sort of pushing them in that direction and not another one. Why do you like these sounds and not these sounds? Because you do, and they have emotional responses, and these ones have different emotional responses. So for me, it's not a question of, well, what can I do to them to change them? It's, well, okay, given that I see these certain concentrations of activity that are within a sort of systemic approach, putting the whole system out of balance, I would rather come up here and tell you what I think there should be more of. And those people who also think that sounds appealing should also engage this work in a more cohesive way, so that we don't even have to necessarily change what people are doing, but just add to the conversation and just add this piece to it, so that there are other things having effects in the system. And one of these would be this sort of ecologically inspired model of education.
Right. It's like, to me, it just sounds like there's a balance that needs to be. There's been a myopia and a specialization that's been highly valued.
Exactly.
In which has its merits, as you say.
Yeah.
But when there's it completely denies a whole other part of the way that reality works, which is relationship. And if you prioritize relationship also, it's just kind of balancing out the scale.
Exactly.
Or kind of adding another element to the analysis, to the view, which I think is important.
Yeah.
I think universities could begin to foster this by just sort of, you don't want to mandate anything, but by encouraging different departments to engage one another on, at least a monthly basis, where there's some kind of interdisciplinary symposium where the different departments come together and share their research and, find connections. And, you would hope that there would be encouraging results where, the physics department will learn something new from, even physics and the sciences, physics, biology, microbiology, they don't even talk to one another.
Yeah.
And, you would hope that there would be some shared insights that would help each respective field in their ongoing research, that they would learn something from another perspective that they had never considered.
Exactly. So the other idea is that, not only do I think that this might be good for cultural institutions in general, but it might actually serve them in their own needs. Right. And in their own agenda to produce academics, to produce interesting research, produce research that leads to products, that leads to whatever, that this might actually work, given that what we see in high relationship in nature is this what is most revealing of sort of truth is difference, in a way. You learn to understand yourself even more by relating to other people, and even more to relating if you've ever been out of the country, all of a sudden you become hyper aware of how American you are. Right. And here you can have discourses about your Americanization and how you have an American framework, but it's always sort of inside of that sphere. But when you go somewhere else, all of a sudden you're walking down the street and you can really feel that there's a different tempo going on around you, and it hits you at a deeper level than just talking about it. And so in that way, you either retreat back to America and go back to what you were doing, or you really engage this and you become like sort of a bigger person that can talk in more languages, you know. And that, I think, is almost always good. I'm not going to say it's always good, but it's for the most part seems like a pretty good thing right now. And I think disciplines might function in the same way, where maybe it's not about like, okay, well, my theory invalidates your theory, but the fact that they're so different and coming together reveals what those theories actually are, that you might not even know what your own framework is. And I think academic institutions operate in the same way. So I'm making a broad category statement about the fact that there might be relationships that hold true. They're specific to their environment and to their time, as we've been saying, you know, with Ilya Prigogine, you know, everything is embedded in the flow of time, and everything is relational and contingent. But there might be some sort of like loose sort of trends that go from biological, you know, to the level of populations, to ecosystems, into culture, and into the way that the sort of energy centers of culture relate to each other. And so one way to model this would just be to understand that, okay, we're pretty comfortable with the fact that, you know, organisms make populations, populations make species and ecosystems and bioregions on the planet. You know, and we understand to some extent that some organisms can influence entire ecosystems in the same way that ecosystems certainly influence organisms. There's a recursive relationship going on here. We were talking about that they sort of define and shape each other. One implies the other. Okay? You don't find polar bears in Hawaii. You know, it doesn't happen unless we put them there. But so the idea that, you know, an idea could change a culture in the same way that culture certainly produces certain kinds of ideas over certain others because you already have a framework, is similar. And in some way, these two systems are really part of the same system. Without trying to totalize it, or without trying to say that it's all integrated in this way, because it's not, because everything appears to be unique in this interesting way. But there are relationships that seem to work, and a lot of those relationships seem to depend on difference interacting with difference. So the best thing going that I have seen so far is sort of what we're doing here with you know, what they call interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary education. And interdisciplinary education, you know, is sort of, in a way, it's sort of that hybrid approach that we were looking at, where it's like, okay, well, how are we to understand why American culture is the way it is? Why is it this way and not another way? So you pull in various aspects of, you know, anthropology, and environmental science, and psychology, and all of these things, and you try and understand it, you know, and there's a lot of richness there. Or the other way to do it is what's called, you know, transdisciplinary education, which is sort of taking a step even deeper and looking at, well, okay, why is it that, you know, there are methodologies that are valued, you know, sort of the scientific method or the reductive approach, that are applied to fields of inquiry that are unrelated in the university, but they share these biases again, they share these sort of cultural viewpoints, and sort of rather than understanding how the disciplines relate to each other or how they can be put together, understanding what organizes organization in the first place. Why do things get organized in this way? And that, I think, is, you know, what needs to be developed, and that, you know, this is oftentimes too used to solve like more complex issues of, you know, the conflicting ideologies that if you took them as literal truths could never reconcile with one another because they immediately eliminate the possibility for the other one to exist. You know, but looking at them in a different way, the fact that in some way they've created each other, in some way they're driving each other, frames the conversation in a different light, where it's not right or wrong. It's a question of effects, and it's a question of what kind of effects do you want to see. So it's kind of like at the limit of my thinking on this.
It would require some like popularization or like general acceptance of like some equivalent of the scientific method on a systems scale. Like the scientific method is generally accepted across disciplines.
Right.
Right. So some sort of equivalent that would then apply to the way that relationships work.
Yeah.
You know?
For me, that's kind of what this hinges on. Is if we use that language of acceptability, like how do you create a science of putting information together, rather than just having like information, hopefully nebulously finding other pieces of valuable information, or having a few people who are interested in a broad spectrum of things trying to put it together, but really coming up with like a system that you could come to a school with and say, hey, if you put these specific types of things in a relationship, if you ask these kinds of questions to a variety of disciplines, then you're going to generate a high level of ideas. And these ideas would be of a certain nature. And you could actually sort of start to make it less of an arbitrary process and more of something, the interdisciplinary model is really focused on problem solving. So rather than orienting itself, like most disciplines are oriented around sort of like producing expert knowledge in a field of general activity, without saying that this is what you're supposed to do with this. It gives you a certain amount of training that then lets you go get a job. The interdisciplinary model is more based on like, well, we have this problem in the world, this social problem. We have this gentrification going on here. What do we need to draw from to address this issue? And we'll train you in doing that, and we'll pull from whatever basket of categories that we need to let people really address that problem. This is like what's going on with like community mental health. It's like a really interdisciplinary, problem-oriented psychology. It's not a psychology that's based on, well, we're going to teach you the history of psychology. We're going to teach you what the APA requires you to know, and then we're going to send you off on your way to start a private practice. This is addressing, okay, we have this population of people in inner cities that need mental health the most, and in order to address these issues, you need a variety of cultural, anthropological, psychological, and whatever else you can think of to address this problem. So it's organized around that, rather than around sort of abstract ideals.
I think another question is, you said that the scientific method is generally accepted throughout all the scientific fields, but then how is science and the scientific method related to culture and the multiple cultures that we have on the planet? Like, if we're going to planetize, we need some sort of basis for arriving at a common understanding of truth. And
do we?
Yeah.
Well, how else do we come to deal with ecological problems if,
dealing with a problem doesn't necessitate one knows the truth.
There needs to be a truth in the sense of there is a problem, though. Like, everyone needs to agree that, okay, this river is polluted and something needs to be done about it.
True.
Right.
Yes.
Truth in that practical sense of ecological problem, species are dying, people are getting sick.
Yeah.
It's like value. That's value truth. It's like what's higher value.
It's a question of legitimization. Like, what is legitimate knowledge and what is sort of opinion or a lesser knowledge?
Right. Because I look at Brian's work as an example of how science can become sort of transcultural, at least cosmology, because there is, you look through the telescope, you can see the evidence for the story. Right. It's not just made up by some specific cultural mode of discourse. It's an actual, you can look at it. Anyone can see it. It doesn't matter what language you speak. But then there are other sciences that become.
Well, what people see.
But that's also a product of a culture, of a Western culture. Going back to the Greek tradition, where the predicating words that eventually became true and false, aletheia and suedos. Aletheia means to make visible. Right. Because from the Greek thought, the eyes were the ways in which you found the truth of a thing. Everything was visual. Right. So visual representation and visual
proof.
Yeah, visual proof is how we get to truth, and that's a very, very cultural assumption.
This is true. So this is the problem then. How to arrive at a planetary consensus about how to be human on this earth. what is the medium to facilitate that? If science can't
Exactly.
do it,
And I think we can point to sort of two things that modern culture really strives for. One is that there's a pre-social humanity, that there's like an essential humanity, and two, just what you were saying, that there's also a transcultural humanity. That there's something in the future that we can all agree on, and that there's also a past that we all came from.
right?
And I'm interested in those topics. I think they're really interesting, and I do think we have a shared fate, and I do think we have a common origin. But I'm also not so sure if identifying those particularities are really necessary to act in the world right now.
Yeah.
And I don't know if they do more good than harm, particularly coming from our sort of imperial post-colonial perspective.
Yeah, I mean, if everybody in the globe sat around and tried to establish some sort of a global understanding of how to ascertain what is true or false, that's going to take a lot more time. The polar ice cap's going to melt
Exactly.
before that happens.
Exactly.
And we all die.
But we also have to keep in mind, Prigoghine's comment that for humans, reality is embedded in the flow of time. Truth is embedded in the flow of time.
Uh-huh.
Truth changes with time.
Right.
So you can have a truth at point A during time T given a certain set of relationships, but not like an all-encompassing truth.
Yeah. I think there's something really powerful about starting with a theory and a person that is so well known as like Darwin, for example, and saying, well, here is what Darwin's interpretation, like what our society has interpreted Darwin to mean,
Right.
which is like survival of the fittest.
Yeah.
Which is actually, and so then if you take that, something as well known as that, and actually reinterpret it to be like, no, well, it's actually how a system relates, and there's this coevolution in between, and the interaction and the relationships are like key in that evolution. I think it's like kind of coming in the back door a little bit.
It is coming in.
Like
But
you're
at least
taking
there's a
something
door to
that's-
go in.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But there's a really important, because science is something that is recognized and agreed upon as having like truth and validity. So if you use a symbol of science
Exactly.
to begin this discussion and to kind of as an entry point, as a doorway,
Yeah.
I think there's something really powerful about that.
No, I think that's key too.
Yeah.
You could almost
That's why this approach is this approach. That's why there's it's a strategic use of language to get to sort of ideals that are missing in the world.
Exactly. And it's a huge paradigm shift to think about like evolution as a systemic thing, as the result of relationships, like a synergistic relationship, and that is something that I think could actually be very readily applied. And it's not a huge jump, and it's something that can be very readily applied to like advocating for this relationship-based cosmology.
I think there's not just one Darwin. I mean, you can go into the Origin of Species and see the beginnings of ecology in there.
Absolutely.
I mean, I can't quote him word for word, but like the last page of Origin of Species, he talks about like this tangled bank of, by a pond where like all these different organisms are interacting with one another, and then somehow, evolution is brought forth out of that process. And so even though most of his theory is still embedded in that, object-centered Newtonian approach, you can see that he still recognizes the primacy of relationship. It's just he needs to be read in a new way so that is emphasized rather than his Newtonian side. But you can definitely bring a more ecological perspective out of Darwin if you looked for it.
Yeah, and this is what Whitehead says too. If you're reading a book written in the 18th century about the 6th century in the 20th century, then you're reading three histories at the same time.
Right.
Because you're bringing your interpretation of what's happening, your view, to this person's view, who's interpreting the 6th century from the 18th with 18th century values.
Right.
So this whole thing, is Darwin, how does Darwin show up in different spaces? How is Darwin weaponized in some ways? How
Right,
can
it's a
he
powerful
chisel his
name.
words into a spearhead and
That's a great way to look at it.
jab at people? Or how is Darwin turned into like this like great potential opening for creativity? It's like,
Because that's what happens sometimes with science, it's weaponized. It's, a theory is used to prove some cultural or value-based judgment. It happens.
It's used to prove that action is justified, like in some universal sense.
Right. It's a whole is-ought distinction that's not being respected.
Okay, so that's my thing.
I've been thinking about something really similar in terms of the body in Western medicine. Thinking about the parallels of the human body being singled out as different systems not working together. So with pharmaceuticals and stuff, they target a certain symptom and mask the problem when in fact there's an entire system of organs and tissues and everything working together in order to work. But yeah, and trying to overthrow that same kind of idea that it's not systematized or that.
Well, Moran says the same thing. If you think about everything as a machine, the analogy falls short right away because machines are built with individual parts that are built individually of each other and then are put together. But in organisms, in life systems, all of the parts are coming up together at the same time. It's not building a mitochondria and then building a ribosome and then building a nucleus and then putting them together. They're coming up in relation to each other.
So this was born out of Descartes, too, and all of it. Perhaps.
Well, it depends what we want to read into Descartes. It's the same question that Matt was bringing up. Do we want him to be our villain or do we want him to be useful?
I'm starting to reappreciate him now.
Yeah.
He's not. I don't think he should be the villain anymore. Because it wasn't as though. It's kind of. I can't really defend him for saying that animals can't feel and all that stuff, but he wasn't trying to say that at least human beings were only machines. He was still protecting the soul and the spiritual element very tightly. It's just the dualism that, when we became more materialistic, all of a sudden the soul half just went out the window. But, he wasn't like in a way he was kind of like a Vedantist, in a way that, like, when he did his meditations, he was really performing this sort of exercise of consciousness where he was disidentifying with everything until he arrived at, like, the final witnessing consciousness, But, yeah, it's off the beaten track.
Like being squeezed through a hole like this and it's
Yeah.
thrown all over the place and having to grab the pieces back.
Right. But no, like what Adam was saying, you can't take an organism apart and put it back together again and expect it to be alive anymore. It's not. Right.
That's why disease is so rampant and chronic disease.
Yeah. Well, people, when you go to a hospital, odds are some kind of mistake is going to happen where, you're going to end up getting an infection or taking the wrong medication or whatever because it's so compartmentalized and fragmented. It's almost more dangerous to be in the hospital than anywhere else because they treat you like a machine. That'd be the best proving ground for any new systematic approach to integrating specialized fields would be the hospital.
I feel like that would be initial because it's the human body and it's very personal.
Right.
So I was thinking if we were going to try and implement anything, that maybe something related to.
The university too is.
Well, I think that if I could make a value judgment at the end of my little spiel,
Please
would
do.
be that find an actual site where things are happening and understand your thinking in terms of that site, rather than sitting around and thinking about what could be or what makes logical sense, because you can go on like that forever and ever. Go somewhere, an ecosystem, a hospital, a school. Figure out what the energy flows in that place are, what the actual living dynamics are that are happening there, and then base your thinking on that. And start somewhere locally like that.
Aren't we in part already doing that?
I am.
Yeah.
Like here?
But I'm saying that's I feel like, well, how do we come to like a truth statement that would organize what people do everywhere? Like let's try and reorganize a local institution that
really
you can be a part of.
It's just a theoretical question. It may not have any relevance whatsoever.
But that's the response.
Yeah.
But why do we want the true statement? Why do we want the universal truth? Just looked at me like I shot your grade.
No.
What the fuck?
I don't want the universal
Step out of
No,
some
I
intellectual
don't-
closet? Like, I'm not a big fan of universal truth.
No, I don't know if I care.
About the universal truth, or
It's like a whole nother big envelope of things that I don't have good answers for, and I've never heard good answers for. So. All right.
hold on, something that's been interesting for me to think about came up for me in class on Friday. During my reading and writing culture class, Richard was talking about just kind of how the academic institution functions at this point in time in terms of knowledge production, wherein, particularly, as I'm learning from looking at dissertations and whatnot in my integrative seminar class, like, the large crux of engaging in a dissertation is you read, you pick your topic, you do this big literature review, and you find that one space where somebody hasn't talked about this thing yet.
Sure.
And then that's what you do, because that's the gap. So one can characterize that as knowledge production for the sake of knowledge production, as opposed to what I feel like you're getting at with this model, which is knowledge production for, the way I think my program would language it would be for alliance, but as you've been discussing here, for that relationality, for these relationships,
Let's not
to
fill
build
gaps. Let's
rather
build
than
bridges.
just,
Yeah.
rather than just like,
I guess-
this is a hole that needs to be filled. Why does it need to be filled? It's a hole. That's what you do with holes. You fill them.
It's a career. It's not a hole.
Oh. Some people's careers are holes.
Most people's careers are holes.
Most people. Yeah. But I'm very excited by this alternate method, alternate model, wherein I feel like that's a
How do you know
great.
this isn't the primary model?
Fuck it is now for me. So.
I sold one person.
Well, we've had plenty of discussions about this. I've been sold on this for a while, but it's nice to see as we've gone through this process with this group over the semester. Like,
Yeah, and this is very much.
It becomes more and more solidified every day in the way that I think about everything I do in this institution.
So let the cat out of the bag. It's because me and JJ had sex 2 years ago. Not really. But.
Seriously, I was
That's what
Alaska
birthed.
then.
That's what birthed this.
That's what
this
birthed
group.
this.
Wow.
Yeah. It's
Impressive.
a freak child.
Okay, so can we maybe take 5 minutes and then
Gebser it.
hear from Molly
Sure.
and Jean Gebser? Cool. Those fields, some people need to move to think, that's how they think, they move, and it's like, it's not just again, Professor Mupania, genius statements.
Badass that he is.
Anthropology, he made the statement that, we don't just need diverse education, but we need diverse opinions about what diversity actually means. That we have systems that are diverse, but they're really diverse from one perspective. So in reality, they're just kind of reiterations of the same thing in different ways. And it might be that it's that viewpoint that doesn't work.
It just gave me a really exciting thought. Rather than the epistemological debate, what is truth? How do we know about truth? Take truth out of there, replace it with diversity or diverse. Now, how do we diversify systems? How do we look at diversity? What is diversity?
Yeah.
It's a very, very different conversation.
And I think it
with
comes
very,
out
very
of
similar
I think it
structures.
comes out of sort of the quote unquote postmodern framework, which leaves you in a base sense with an intense relationality. But I guess what I would say is different about what I'm doing is it does have that sort of flavor to it.
Oh yeah.
But that it's actually grounded. How does this work? How on earth do we make this work? How on earth does this work? On the planet, how does this actually work? You know, that's like, there's like these weird little statements that we throw around like that actually, if you stop and think about them, like, well, how on earth would this work? Being that that's where we are, and that's probably where we're going to be. So there's like a unifying factor that is the planet. For me, that's like the lowest common denominator.
Yeah. And just because Gebser's on my mind, I realized that Earth, we spell it E-A-R-T-H, but the German word means
yeah.
origin.
Yeah.
That's why we say Earth. It's where we came from.
The origin.
Yeah.
I don't know. Given that yesterday was Earth Day, it's kind of appropriate.
What do you
Like,
think,
shouldn't
Mary?
every day be Earth Day?
Yeah.
No one would think.
Seems like there's a basic reorientation too from like the truth debate is wanting to grasp something. It's wanting to like have some concrete control.
Right.
Over like this is a finite piece of knowledge that I can look at and specify and grab, as opposed to this, which is like there is no such thing as that. It's all about relationality, and it's all about how these little discrete units interact with each other, and those interactions are where the interesting thing is happening. And both are relevant, but I mean, that kind of is. You could extrapolate that to like a lot of other. That's a metaphor for many other like levels of thinking. Like I don't know, capitalism is all about this one particular form of success.
Yeah.
As opposed to there are all sorts of other ways that human can be fulfilled. It's not just one. It's not just the financial bottom line.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's like it's a reorientation of thought at a very basic level.
Yeah. I had a conversation with a buddy of mine. We were talking about time.
Uh-oh.
I don't even remember how we got started on that, but he was asking me some question about time, and I just stopped for a second. I was like, I can't even.
Where do you begin?
Yeah, like I essentially told him, it was like I can't. I refuse to define an abstract concept now. I will not say what capitalism is. I will not say what time is. The only way that I can talk about these things is to describe my relationship to them. So, like, this is my relationship to capitalism. This is what I infer other people's relationships to capitalism are. Like, and the way I described it was like, it's the same way I would talk about a friend I know. Like, what do I know about Matt? I can't just say this is what Matt is. Like, here's a little sentence soundbite. This is everything that Matt is, because that's the epistemological will to truth. Like, we can reduce Matt into a soundbite.
Mm-hmm.
Quick, easy. There's Matt out on the table. Nice short sentence. Or I can describe how I met Matt, like what our relationship has been like, how I feel about that, how he might feel about that. Like, where you're describing relationality, where I feel like you're actually touching on something.
Right. And in so doing, it's changing.
This is this guy Matt I know. Yeah.
It's
and
evolving.
It isn't a static thing.
It's not a fixed description.
It's
just
always
hanging out
implying
somewhere.
this dynamic interrelation.
Right. So it's not so much description; it's conversation.
Yeah. And it's a small change, but it's really fucking important.
It's interesting because that's how I think and feel and operate, and yet that's probably part of the reason why perhaps I've had difficulty, especially. I wouldn't say I've been totally conscious of the trouble I've had in doing a master's degree in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness department, but it is that. It's that there are these ways of thinking that have come into or from the past that want to define, delineate, do this, like you were saying, but yet, Mary, if you feel the same way, it's more of a feminine way of interacting, is the relationality and the,
Yeah, it's like it brings it in too tight. Everything gets just too tight and too static, and it's not the way things are, and it implies that when you get to that point of definition, that that's the whole story.
Yeah, that's all there is.
Whereas, in relation, the way, sorry, what's your name?
JJ,
the way you were speaking, it implies that the relationality implies that you do have a relationship to it, you are saying something of it, but it equally implies that when you stop speaking, that one takes for granted that there's a lot more could be said about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's what Robert McDermott said about time in class. It's like stuck in my head. He says, I know everything about time until you ask me.
Oh, he was quoting Saint Augustine.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That was a quote? Oh,
Mhm.
okay.
I mean,
I
Robert's
agree,
a smart
Robert.
guy. He could have said something like that. But.
That's how I feel. It's the same thing. It's like, I know exactly.
Yeah.
I'm going to be moving about the room, I guess. First, I'd like to say thank you to Adam for helping me to do this a couple times. I think it was necessary. We've had somewhat of a reciprocal support relationship. I appreciated that. This is my Achilles heel. Presenting, I don't often feel confident in what I have to say. Again, like I said, the way that I express myself is often intuitive or artistic or the way I express myself is very expressive. So speaking is trying to put the whole world into a straw. So this is what I'm going to try and do. And I'm glad it's an intimate setting. I'm actually glad that very few people showed up. So I'm going to discuss Gebser, Jean Gebser, because I've found myself just like a moth to a light with him. I don't know what it is. I keep going back to his ideas and finding so much that I can identify with. And what I'd like to frame it around, I think, is more of a question of how I can, in a larger context, understand what the evolution of consciousness is. Matthew has quite a bit of background with Gebser. Talk a little bit. But Adam Dolezal is another PCC anthropology hybrid, and he warned me about addressing the evolution of consciousness just yesterday, finding out what that I was going to talk about Jean Gebser. And it was interesting to hear about it just yesterday. So it really made me reframe what I'm going to talk about. Again, it's a conversation Adam just had about being so entrenched in something and not really seeing to the left and to the right, having these blinders on. So I'm really interested in understanding a wider scope of other disciplines, how they view these ideas. But I'm most fascinated by Jean Gebser's research into the realm of the arts and how it has to do, what the arts have to do with the coming age of the integral era, a perspectival world, he also calls it. So he has defined 4 mutations, and there are 5 structures of consciousness, according to him. I'm going to draw this little drawing that I just came up with earlier, what seemed kind of intuitive to me for the archaic structure. And there was the magical. Mythical. The mental. And then this is the final, the aperspectival, or the integral era. I'm not sure how it looks, really. What I first came up with was having numerous circles, maybe all overlapping like that. Just came up with this today, so I don't know. But what happens is, according to Gebser, in the beginning, there's origins, and we're all enmeshed in nature, in the experience of our environment, of time. There's a timelessness, a spacelessness. It is characterized by a time where the soul is yet dormant, a time of complete non-differentiation of human and universe. So it's the beginning. kind of like before the fall, the
Golden
paradise.
Age.
Yeah, the golden era. And then we have moved into the magical at one point, which is characterized by an emergent awareness of nature. So we begin separating from nature and begin exerting our dominance over it in certain ways. And he says that all magic occurs in the natural, vital, egoless, spaceless, and timeless sphere. Yeah, I just pictorialized it as having us here in the middle, encapsulated within. And then as these structures and mutations change, we start to move outside of it. And as Ali mentioned to me earlier, it looks almost like the ego development of in the self, regarded by Jung. I thought that was interesting. It was almost a micro-macro relationship. And then the mythic is the emergent awareness of soul. The word becomes very prominent. He says the word is always a mirror of inner silence, and myth becomes reflector of the soul. Nearly all myths contain an element of consciousness emergence to the extent that they reflect the emergent awareness of soul. And then, so this is the one right here, the mental is where we are said to be existing right now. And this is where I'm going to jump off from, because it was during this consciousness structure that perspective was discovered in the Renaissance period by the vision of the artists that were, and it was hand in hand with geometry and the thinkers of that time, but it was really put into vision through the artistry of the here. All right, so the mental, as Gebser describes, is characterized by this perspectival vision, which was, like I said, discovered during the Renaissance. It has informed our way of seeing by fixating our attention on the space, in the three-dimensional, but mostly fixated on space. Sorry, I'm blanking. The lengths at which the artists of his time went to recreating the mathematical proportion and perspective of reality was so pronounced that it began to really affect the way we saw the world. It was fragmentary. We started to segment our reality in terms of this way of seeing. And so what Gebser has done in his work in understanding the manifestations of the aperspectival world through art is seeing the way that modern artists have foreseen and foretold new visions, new ways of seeing, or breaking out of this perspectival way of envisioning our reality. And I'm just really fascinated by that myself, because I am an artist, and it's been very profound for me to see the way a thinker has put art into the intellectual realm. So you see I'm having trouble articulating. If I could show you, it'd be easier. But I do have examples that are pretty key from Gebser himself. So I think the first artist that is most interesting was Cézanne. He did multiple renderings of, well, not renderings, but he had multiple examples of toying with perspectival rendering of paintings, sorry,